Lela Gilbert, the author of several books from Israel. You're an American who literally transplanted yourself. One could say you made Aliyah to Israel. Is that right?
Just about. If I could have called it that, I would have.
What's the plight of the Palestinian Christians, the Christians who were living in the West Bank and even Gaza, who don't have the protections of Israel and the Jewish state?
Well, they're in dire straits, some of them. And I have had contact with Christians in Bethlehem because they're very close. It's 10 minutes from where I live, or 15. And there's a young man there, just to give you an example, who has contacted me a couple of times about arson that's taken place in churches. And at one point, and I talked to him as openly as I could. This was telephone, and he said, if anyone finds out I'm talking to you, I'll be killed. And I thought, you know, that this is, the problem isn't just religious, it's also the idea of collaborating with the Israelis, but it is very much tied into jihad. And so as the Christians have moved out, and there's only like a 4% percentage of Christians there now, and it's more and more Muslim. And so they blame that on the occupation, except why are the Muslims moving in if it's so bad under the occupation?
Mm-hmm. So what's happening to the Christians and why?
The Christians in the Middle East are under tremendous persecution. And this is religious. It's entirely religious. It's based on, as far as ISIS is concerned, it's based on a Wahhabi view that these are infidels and they should either convert or die because the land needs to be cleansed. There's an element of that in Hamas and in some of the radical groups in Israel as well. Not as open, but as certainly as hostile. Mm-hmm. And so we have a similar prejudice, obviously, against the Jews from those groups. And it's not all national, it's religious. The idea in the most apocalyptic Muslim groups is that Israel or Jerusalem needs to be cleansed of infidels before the Mahdi can come.
The Mahdi?
Yes, either the Sunni Mahdi or the 12th Imam in Shia Islam. So you have similar parallel tracks. And the idea of cleansing the land religiously is being done, or it's attempted to be done. I mean, you read their propaganda and you see that that's bringing the black banners into Jerusalem is part of the fulfillment.
But our definition of infidels and the definition of infidels that they're working with are very different. How?
Very much so. Well, we have not converted to Islam, for starters. And we're also Western. We're also, some of us are very pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, and so these are all strikes against us that are pretty clear in the Quran and certainly in the Hadith.
What has happened to the Christians in places like Bethlehem and places that the Palestinians control?
Well, they're fleeing like crazy. They're leaving en masse. And the ones that are still there are constantly scrutinized.
Why are they fleeing? What are they fleeing from?
Well, it's almost like a mafiosi operation where they have to kind of sometimes pay protection money, or they're watched closely, or they have to...
Mafiosi from who? From the Israeli Jews?
No. They're not the Jews. There are no Jews left there. Israelis can't even go into Bethlehem. It's illegal. These are Muslims.
Palestinian Muslims.
Yes, and those under the authority of the PA, which is very heavily influenced by this. The PA is less that way than Hamas, but all of them have this influence of cleansing the land, the mentality. Abbas has said again and again, there will be no Jews in the Palestinian state.
In his proposed Palestinian state. But Israel has 20% Arabs. Why can't there be Jews in the Judean Samarian proposed nationalist Palestine?
You'll have to ask Abbas. But he's getting lots of money from a lot of places, so it's not too hard to figure it out.
What do you mean, that he's getting money from the Arabs, from the extremist fundamentalists?
Of course. He's getting money from everywhere, and it's going in his pocket along with other places. So it's very corrupt, and it's very anti-Semitic and anti-Christian. Now, there are Christians that cooperate with the PA. There are old churches, some of the Orthodox, some of the Catholics, that cooperate, and they show up at Christmas in Bethlehem. But for the believing Christians that are biblical, it's not so good.
You've edited a book and written Persecuted, the Global Assault on Christians.
Right.
While we're talking about the Middle East, where does the global assault come from politically?
Well, the worst country in the world is North Korea, and it comes from this crazed Maoist mentality there with this dictator who's a cult figure. But as we wrote this book, we had to increase the number of chapters on Islam because there are so many increasing attacks on Christians in Muslim countries. So it's certainly the most, and it's the most predominant persecutor. I think it's 80% of the persecution of Christians in the world today is under the hand of Islam. But there are others. There are Tibetans that are attacking Christians. There are Hindu groups. There are other groups, but they're on small scale. And there's some crazy regimes that don't like Christians. But by and large, it's Islamist.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent do you feel that the Obama administration or that the U.S. administrations, could include George Bush, have been willing to acknowledge the Islamic bigotry and discrimination against Christians?
Well, certainly the Obama administration has been very negligent in this way. I mean, we could go on and on about why, and I don't have all the answers. But what I do believe is that they are discriminating against Christians who want to come to this country, and they're allowing a lot of Muslim refugees in, and I don't think there have been more than a dozen Christians, I could be wrong, about Syrian Christian refugees. So they're going to Europe, and the Christians that are going to Europe are hoping to bring their families into Europe, but they also are aware of the threats amongst the refugee groups they traveled with. I mean, there were radicals. I talked to a couple in Munich about what happened on their trek, and they said there were Daesh people alongside them coming into
Daesh
Europe.
Meaning?
Yes, yeah, meaning ISIS.
ISIS. Daesh people among the immigrants?
Yes, that's what they said. And I asked them directly, and they laughed and looked at each other and said, yes, for sure, we know.
Are they traveling on counterfeit Syrian passports?
No, they had their own passports. This couple that I met had enough money in the family for their parents to send them. And so they had managed to get to Turkey, and then they had done the boat trip across into Greece, and then on trains and by foot they'd made it to Germany.
Right.
And they had just received work permits, so they were at least likely to be able to stay.
How are the ISIS people traveling? Under what identities are they getting into Europe?
Well, I'm sure they have false passports. Syria, they probably print them themselves. I don't really know, but they're very sophisticated. Anybody that thinks they're a primitive barbaric, they're barbaric, but they're very primitive, and their technology is foolish. If you look at their media, they're very sophisticated.
What's your other book, Israel Through the Eyes of a Christian Sojourner?
That book, the title is Saturday People, Sunday People. And that's the subtitle, Israel Through the Eyes of a Christian Sojourner. It started out sort of a memoir of my experience, but the more I wrote for various news outlets, I did some writing for the Jerusalem Post and still do occasionally. I learned about some lies that were being told about Israel and about the Jews, and I started looking into some of them. And so those articles, plus my research on the 850,000 Jews that were expelled from Muslim lands, that made up the bulk of the book, and it also gave it the title, which it comes from a jihadi saying, the nice way of saying it is first comes Saturday, then comes Sunday, which is one way of saying it, but on the flag that's in my book, a Palestinian flag, and in Arabic it says, on Saturday we kill the Jews, on Sunday we kill the Christians.
So would the expulsion of the Jews from Arab lands in the 1940s and 50s have been the Saturday, and are we at the Sunday now?
We're at the Sunday now, although Jews are fleeing Northern Europe now for similar reasons.
Right.
But yes, there's now, actually the US finally managed to call it genocide in Iraq and Syria at the hand of ISIS, Islamists. And so, yes, it's the Sunday people's turn in the Muslim world.
the Christians of the Muslim world. How about Egypt, for example, which expelled its Jews also in
Right.
the early 1950s?
The Coptic Christians there have been under the gun for decades. El-Sisi, the new president, seems to be taking a slightly different view. Some of my Egyptian friends are very cynical about him, and some are a little bit grateful. So we'll see how it comes out.
How about the Jews of Iraq?
Well, this is...
Sorry, the Christians. I know that
No,
Iraq was a tremendous Christian community.
Right, the Christians in Iraq have left en masse. There were, I think, 1.5 million Christians in 2003 or 4, and now there are less than 500,000. There are more Assyrian Christians in Chicago than there are in Iraq now. Assyrian Christians being a denomination that's very ancient, 1st century.
Assyrian, as it's called.
Assyrian, right. They speak Aramaic.
Aramaic, which is the language
Of Jesus, yes.
Yeah, the conventional language. What should Christians today glean from the Islamic campaign against the Jewish state to plan for their own future trouble?
Well, I think it's important for Christians and Jews to see that they're standing on common ground. This persecution is against the people of the book, is the way it's worded in the Islamic world. But my own view is that God gave his word to the Jews in the Torah. And Christians believe that Jesus was the living word, that he became flesh and dwelt among them. Both have the revelation that God gave to his people. And I don't think that's very popular in the Islamist world. That doesn't mean every Muslim in the world hates Christians at all, because I've got some wonderful Muslim friends myself who are reformers at heart. Mm-hmm. But the radicals are very much targeting both Jews and Christians, always have, if you read the history. Pogroms on both sides during the Ottoman Empire for sure, and before. So I think we need to look at this as something to unite us and to say we will stand together against this threat.
How strong have Christian political forces within the West, and specifically the United States, how strongly have they been opposing this persecution and lobbying Washington to be more active?
Well, it's a very good question, because Jews always ask me this: what are the Christians doing? And they're not doing enough, and they're not uniting, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I'm not sure that they are paying attention to these different groups who look very different from evangelicals, that they're actually part of their community. They're horrified by the beheadings on the beach in Libya, but what can they do and what should they do? And certainly lobbying Washington would be a very good place to start. Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny, the Jews quarrel among themselves, as you probably know. But when Jewish people are threatened in the world, they come together and they march the streets and they do the media campaign and they put the big ads in the news. And you just don't see that in the Christian community. And I honestly don't understand why it can't be put together, but maybe it's a lack of leadership, I don't know.
Well, but surely with the 700 Club, and you have, we're in a Calvary church here that also is very concerned about a Christian survival, and in San Diego you have a large movement. Surely those who are socially conscious, where are they?
Well, they're fragmented. They're speaking up, yes. They're on social media. There are groups that are doing a very heroic work. I work at the Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson Institute. That's one of the 2 groups there I work with. And there's a lot of lobbying there. There's a lot of work done there. But it's not enough. And also, this administration in America is the most hard-nosed about caring about Christians ever.
The Democrat administration.
The Obama administration.
Would a succeeding Democrat administration be different?
Well, considering the field that's open to us, I rather doubt it. But I can't say. I don't know who could be much worse.
Well, aside from the leader, if the appointees, the bureaucrats who are in positions of taking action, remain in action from one Democrat regime to another, or administration to another, Would you see any change with anything but a Republican administration?
Well, even that's tough because the State Department doesn't change at all, and there are no elected officials there. And they've had the same kind of Arabist policies for decades. So how to make a difference? It's got to be Congress. Even if there's good leadership in the White House, Congress has to back up the funding. So it's really a matter of the voters getting out and saying, we care about this, and I don't know if that's what they're focusing on right now. They've got all these other issues that are internal American issues, so I don't know.